Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something we can all relate to, sleep. Or, to be more exact, how people in medieval times slept. It turns out, it was much weirder than most of us could ever guess. So, before you get too comfortable, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always really interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, turn down the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft, humming sound, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Before electricity, TikTok, and sleep experts, people in medieval times had a nighttime routine that would confuse anyone. Today, who loves their sleep? It was called segmented sleep, a natural, two-part sleep cycle, split right in the middle, like an old, hard biscuit. The routine was easy. After the sun went down, most people went to bed early. They would fall into what they called the first sleep. Then, after about 4 hours, they would wake up on purpose. This wasn't seen as a sleeping problem. It was just how sleep worked. This watch period between the two sleeps was seen as a practical and useful time. Sometimes, it was also a surprisingly social time. People used this time to pray, read holy books, take care of their fires, or check on their farm animals. Because nothing messes up your sleep like worrying if your goat is still in the yard. And yes, this was also thought to be the best time to be intimate. Medieval doctors and marriage guides wrote that the body was well rested and the mind was calm during this time. This sounds like a polite way of saying they were too tired to argue. So, if you ever thought you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just remember, your ancestors were setting a very different standard. The second sleep would come after this break, and it would last until sunrise. Everyone, from monks to farmers, followed this nightly routine. Even famous writers like Chaucer mentioned it in their stories. This means that, yes, even in medieval books, people were writing about not sleeping well. Interestingly, modern science suggests that segmented sleep might actually be more natural for humans. The two-sleep cycle matches how our bodies' natural clocks work when there is no artificial light. So, the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., don't worry. Just whisper to yourself, "Ah yes, the watch has begun," and go pretend to take care of a fireplace. It wasn't until the industrial era, with its factories, gas lamps, and a growing fear of not being productive, that people started to push the idea of 8 straight hours of sleep, as if sleep was a sport with a time limit. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a failure. It was the schedule, and everyone was on it, whether they liked it or not. Let's talk about beds, or what medieval people used as beds. In our world today, we worry about thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and if a mattress feels like a cloud. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of things that used to be alive, now squashed down by poor sleep and a lot of sadness. The usual peasant bed was a straw mattress called a pallet. This was literally straw or hay stuffed into a bag made of rough cloth, if they were lucky enough to have a bag. If not, it was just straw on the floor. It was possibly wet, and maybe a cat had already claimed it. These pallets were not comfortable, but they were better than nothing, which was the other option. Straw was cheap, easy to find, and good for keeping out the cold. It was also a great home for hiding bugs, lice, and sometimes even a mouse from the fields. This made sleeping an exercise in staying very still. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit you, you just moved a little and hoped it would go away. If a family had a little more money, or at least a strong back, they might put the straw mattress on a wooden frame. This didn't make the sleep much better, but it did slightly lower the chances of waking up with beetles in your ear. Linens were a rare luxury. Most people slept in the same clothes they wore all day. Pajamas weren't really a thing, and neither was personal space. Whole families, children, parents, maybe a grandparent all slept together in the same area, sometimes on the same pile of straw. If you got too hot, you could always roll over and bump into your cousin's elbow. Of course, nobles had real beds. They had large wooden frames, feather mattresses, sheets with designs on them, and canopies to keep out cold drafts and, hopefully, the lice. These beds were so precious that they were passed down in wills. You didn't inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's strangely lumpy feather bed. Still, for most medieval people, a bed wasn't a place of comfort. It was a place to not die of cold, to stay away from the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of being rich enough to one day sleep on something that didn't make noise or rustle. When we hear nightcap today, we think of a nice little drink, maybe with some whiskey near a warm fire after making a bad decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a drink. It was a hat, a real and often silly-looking piece of cloth made to keep your head from freezing while you slept. You see, medieval buildings were not very good at keeping people warm. They had stone walls, drafty roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled paper, which didn't do much against the cold, and central heating. That was called a dog, so, to keep their heads warm at night, especially since most body heat escapes through the head, medieval people wore the simple nightcap. These hats came in all shapes and sizes, but the most famous version was long and pointy, like something a wizard, who also cleans chimneys on the side, would wear. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warm cloth they could find without making the family goat angry. For men, it was a useful accessory. For women, it sometimes also served as a head wrap, which helped them stay modest and cover hair that hadn't been washed since last Easter. But nightcaps were about more than just warmth. They were also a social symbol. In some places, married women had to cover their heads all the time. Yes, even while sleeping. The cap itself could have designs or be dyed to show a family's wealth or status, because nothing says, "I'm successful," like going to bed with a tiny flag on your head. In cities, the nightcap even became a sign that you were off duty. If you opened your door wearing one, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not ready to talk." And yes, this hat does mean go away. Of course, nightcaps were often worn with nightshirts, which were basically long, loose shirts. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, but without the ghost and the moral lessons. Sleepwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and sometimes it could catch fire. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is usually only for long flights, ambitious camping trips, or a strange Airbnb mistake. But in medieval Europe, this was completely normal, and you had no choice. Let's say you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule quit in the middle of the road to Norwich. You find an inn, which is a rare luxury itself, and you ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a room, or a bed, or even a very clean spot on the floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that someone else is already in. Medieval inns worked more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy was not a thing. If the bed had room, you were sharing it, usually with total strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or have a weird number of boils. This was not considered rude. It was just a good use of space. Beds could hold 2, 3, or even 4 travelers, depending on their size and how much they could tolerate each other. In bigger cities, you might end up in a large hall with rows of beds and absolutely no personal space. Snoring contests were not judged. Fights over elbow room were common. Sometimes men and women were separated, but not always. Some inns tried to assign beds based on jobs. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, priests with priests, and thieves with other thieves, supposedly. But often, it was first come, first to spread out. And while this might sound like a nightmare to modern people who hate germs, back then, it was much better than sleeping outside with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant revolt. Worried about being robbed, many travelers slept with their money pouch tied to their belt or hidden under their clothes. Others slept on top of their luggage, using it as both a pillow and an alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up with less money. The rich, of course, did not have this problem. Nobles traveled with their own group of people and camped in relative comfort. Or they demanded their own rooms if an innkeeper wanted to keep his roof. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and falling asleep. It was a spiritual task, a nightly risk where your eternal soul was at stake. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to possibly die. That's why bedtime prayers were so popular. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers relaxed with confessions, religious songs, and spiritual cleansing, just in case they died between saying good night and good morning. The idea was simple. You could die at any moment from sickness, fire, demons, or, most dangerously, from being over 30 in the year 1247. So, you had better say your prayers. Not because it was comforting, but because hell was scary, and you didn't want to arrive there uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually messy. A common version was, if I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sounds sweet, right? Except it's basically a legal note written by a 7-year-old, admitting that death was a likely thing to happen at bedtime. Many adults had a whole list of prayers for different dangers. One for when you felt guilty, one for when you thought the devil might be hiding in the roof, and one to prevent the plague, which sadly didn't work very well. Some even prayed to specific saints who were known to watch over sleepers, kind of like holy bodyguards for your soul at the club. The very religious monks, nuns, and very anxious nobles ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. After Compline, they took a vow of silence. This wasn't hard because everyone was already tired, hungry, and a little afraid of the dark. Children were also told to pray, partly because it was good for their souls, and partly because it gave them something to do besides asking why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching. This sounds cute until you realize it was less like a guardian angel and more like a heavenly security system. In short, praying before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute problem-solving. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't really understand how. In the modern world, dreams are usually seen as random nonsense caused by stress, too much cheese, or your brain trying to organize its files in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously, as in, this could affect your soul forever. Serious. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were thought to be messages from God, saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or maybe that weird, holy object you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were messages from heaven. Others were temptations from demons. Either way, you were supposed to pay attention. Maybe write it down, confess it, or not eat for 3 days just to be safe. Religious experts, monks, and people who claimed to see visions spent a scary amount of time trying to understand dreams. Whole books were written about how to figure them out. If you dreamt of fire, it might be hell. If you dreamt of water, it could mean you were being cleaned of sin or that you were going to drown. If you dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish, you had better call a priest right away, and maybe move to a new house. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams was important, because your soul was still active while you slept. This meant that your actions in a dream could show hidden sins or spiritual problems. That slightly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread, that might be your mind confessing that you're too greedy in real life, or maybe you're just hungry, but it was still better to confess it, just in case. Monks and nuns often wrote down their dreams and shared them with their religious leaders. Some were praised for having holy visions during sleep. Others were quietly told to eat fewer onions before bed. Of course, dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles. They were also great story ideas. Medieval stories are full of dream scenes where knights meet angels, demons, or symbolic creatures that speak in poems about being good. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more hidden meanings and fewer happy endings. The church, as you might expect, was suspicious. Not all dreams were from God, and some were believed to be sent by demons to trick innocent people. If you dreamed of something bad, it could mean your soul was under attack, or that you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. In modern times, some people let their pets sleep in their bed. It's a cozy, if sometimes smelly, habit. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a cute personal choice. It was a way to stay warm. Let's start with the basics. Medieval homes were not built for comfort. They had stone walls, no insulation, and drafts so strong they probably had names. Central heating, that was called the family pig. In peasant homes, it wasn't strange for humans and farm animals to sleep in the same room, sometimes in the same bed, and very often on the same pile of straw. Chickens walked around freely, dogs curled up at your feet, pigs snorted softly next to the fire, and if you were lucky, none of them bit you during the night. This wasn't about love, though medieval people certainly cared for their animals. It was about survival. Animals create body heat. They were warm, reliable, and unlike some relatives, they didn't steal the blanket. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner might make the room a degree or two warmer, which, in January, felt like a miracle. Medieval homes, especially those of poorer people, often had just one room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes dying. Everyone, humans and animals, shared the same space. Children might be snuggled between their parents and a goat. A chicken might be your alarm clock. Hygiene. Let's not ask too many questions. For wealthier families, this wasn't as common. Nobles didn't usually sleep next to farm animals, though they might still have lapdogs in bed. This wasn't for heat, but for fashion, and to spread the fleas around. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favorite animals, because nothing says I'm powerful like a dog with its own room and a title. There were problems, of course. Animals can be loud, they can wander off, and they are not known for respecting personal space, but medieval people got used to it. A hoof in the face at 3 a.m. was just part of the bedtime routine. If you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel and thought, this is a bit much, let us introduce you to the medieval monastery dorm. It was a place where comfort went to die quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries didn't believe in personal space, or softness, or fun, really. The typical dorm room had dozens of monks, all sleeping in one large room. They were usually arranged in neat rows, like very moral sardines, beds, if you could call them, that were often wooden planks. Sometimes they had a straw mattress if the head monk was feeling generous, or if it was a holiday. You slept in all your clothes, not to be modest, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more painful than just going to bed ready. The monk's uniform, including the robe, belt, and sandals, served as both spiritual protection and poor insulation. If you got cold, you added another layer. If you got hot, well, you didn't. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. Under the rules of Saint Benedict, if you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might find yourself on bathroom cleaning duty for a week. Snoring, however, was a tricky area. You couldn't control it, but if it bothered others, the Lord might still hold you responsible, or at least your roommates would. Needed to lie still and not sin. That was the goal. Despite the hardship, monks believed their simple beds were training for the afterlife. It was a way to prepare the soul's journey by not giving the body any extra comfort. Sleep was not a pleasure. It was a need that was watched and scheduled like everything else. Some monks even slept sitting up just to avoid any hint of luxury or dreams or blood flow. Compared to this, the peasant's straw pile and snoring pigs almost seem luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge you. Let's talk about something that would scare most modern sleepers: waking up on purpose at 2 a.m. and not for a bathroom break or to look at your phone, but for prayer. Loud, cold, candlelit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was a normal practice. Monks and nuns followed a strict daily schedule based on holy hours, which included matins, the first service of the day. And by day, we mean the darkest part of the night, when even the owls were still deciding if they should wake up. The bell would ring, often rung by someone who lost a bet, and the whole dorm of robed, sleep-deprived people would shuffle off to the chapel in silence. And yes, they were still in their full clothes, because monks didn't do pajamas. The only layering system they believed in was a spiritual one. Inside the chapel, by the light of flickering candles and under the echo of stone ceilings, they would chant religious songs, recite holy texts, and try their best not to fall asleep on their feet. This, by the way, was a real problem. There are records of monks being punished for falling asleep in the middle of a prayer, usually with extra work or more prayers. You fell asleep in matins. Congratulations, you now get to lead the next one. Matins could last an hour or more. Some very dedicated groups stretched it to 2 hours. Imagine trying to stay spiritually focused while your stomach reminds you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson, and your body is actively trying to shut down. Sleep, or, in stricter groups, move straight to studying or working, because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat after 4 hours of broken rest. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and give the first and quietest part of the night to God, without the distractions of daylight, warmth, or deep sleep. It was a powerful symbol of their faith. Feet, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often seen as a luxury, a sign of being independent, peaceful, or just being able to control the blanket. In the medieval world, though, sleeping alone was considered weird, impractical, or just plain unsafe. Let's start with the basics. Warmth. Beds, as we've said, were not very warm. Stone walls and open chimneys didn't do much to keep heating, and central heating was still several plagues away. So, people shared beds for body heat, not for closeness, but for basic survival. Children slept with their siblings, parents, and sometimes the neighbor's kid if they were visiting. It was like a sleepover, but nobody asked if you wanted to be there. But besides warmth, many people believed the night was when the devil did his extra work. Alone in the dark, your soul might be open to temptation, or worse, possession. Having others nearby created a kind of moral safety net. If something went wrong, at least someone would see it or catch the demon first. For children, being alone at night was almost unthinkable, not just for comfort, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were all part of the nightly world. Stories warned against sleeping alone as a path to trouble and spiritual danger. And unlike today's bedtime stories, these tales didn't end with hugs. They ended with people disappearing. Even married couples often shared their beds with children, servants, or random guests. Privacy was not a concept so much as a modern myth. In fact, the idea of two people sleeping alone in a giant bed was so strange that it would have been seen as either wasteful or very, very suspicious. In religious settings, even monks often slept together, and if someone was told to sleep alone, it was often as a punishment. Yes, in some cases, being alone in bed was literally a punishment. The medieval logic was, sleeping alone gives you a chance to sin. Sleeping in a group means public accountability. The next time you're curled up, in your own bed, with your own blanket, in a room that doesn't smell like a goat, enjoy the silence. In medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you. And all of them would be snoring. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up in a class, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a stiff neck and a deep sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle. Some medieval people, especially the rich or very religious, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? For a few reasons, and none of them were very restful. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for your digestion, your lungs, or the general balance of your body's fluids. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this idea made perfect sense, they believed. Sleeping upright helped avoid congestion of the brain, which sounds scary but mostly meant don't drown in your own mucus. Second, there were spiritual worries. Lying flat was considered too close to the position of a dead person. You didn't want to confuse God, or, worse, get the attention of the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. It was superstitious, absolutely. But when your local priest was also the town's health expert, you chose your fights carefully. As a result, people often slept partly sitting up, supported by large pillows, cushions, or the wooden headboard that was like a medieval lozboy. Nobles sometimes had their beds built with angled supports to keep them in a semi-seated position, perfect for digesting their evening meat pie or fighting off surprise demon attacks. Monks took it a step further. In stricter groups, they might even sleep sitting upright on a bench or leaning against a cold wall, with only a hood to make it a little less uncomfortable. This wasn't about health, it was about discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5 a.m. Needless to say, this wasn't about getting good rest. It was about being virtuous, uncomfortable, and having a slightly confusing set of beliefs. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real monsters of the night were already in the sheets. They were small, persistent, and did not care about your prayers. We're talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of the medieval bedroom, the bedbug. Let's be honest about it. Hygiene wasn't exactly a strong point in medieval Europe. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from things that are better left unmentioned. Add to that straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you have the perfect setting for an all-you-can-eat pest party. Fleas and lice were so common, they were practically roommates. Peasants dealt with them every day. Nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were not safe either. In fact, some richer homes had special servants called nitpickers, whose actual job was to remove lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine that as your job title, Master of the Royal Scalp. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the silent killers of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even the cracks in stone walls. They came out at night to feast like tiny vampires. If you ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept in all their clothes, it wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was defense against pests. It was armor. Solutions ranged from slightly effective to impressively crazy. Some homes burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to keep bugs away. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed. This may not have done much to the pests, but it certainly kept romance away. It wasn't just a physical problem either. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or being morally unclean. They were biting reminders of Adam and Eve's fall and of having a bad bed. Entire poems were written about fleas. Some were moral lessons, and some were weirdly romantic, because nothing says I love you like let us be united, like the flea that bites us both. So, while modern sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the strange feeling that something was crawling on your leg, because it was. We've all had nights where we couldn't sleep, but have you ever tried to fall asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No. Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being ready to fight in a joust in your sleep. Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in full armor. It was hot, heavy, and loud. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag of forks. But during a war, or in a dangerous area, sleeping with some armor on was considered the safer choice. Comfort was optional. Survival was very important. A knight on a military campaign might only take off his helmet and gloves, keeping his chainmail shirt or breastplate on, just in case enemies decided to have a surprise party at midnight. There's nothing quite like waking up to the sound of hooves and having to put on your armor while you're still half dreaming about turnips. In castles under attack, soldiers might even sleep with swords or axes by their side, like very aggressive bedtime security blankets. Shields were used as pillows, and if the enemy broke through the walls, well, at least you wouldn't have to get dressed. Priorities. Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restful. Iron doesn't let air through, and chainmail has a bad habit of pinching your skin. Add to that cold stone floors, very little bedding, and the background sounds of snoring friends and crackling torches, and you have a sleep environment that's less comfortable than an airport terminal. Even those not in a battle sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in dangerous places. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in thick, quilted jackets that offered a bit of protection and slightly more padding than just praying for moral support. And let's not forget, armor wasn't exactly quiet. If you rolled over the wrong way, you might make such a loud clanking noise that everyone else woke up and thought the world was ending. Again, in a time when nightly demons, lice problems, and pigs in your bed were not considered strange, you might think that sleepwalking was just one more medieval problem. But oh no, it was much more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people didn't think it was because of stress or being tired. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation, if you wanted to impress the local monk, was not well understood and was often feared. The idea that someone could get up from their straw bed, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall was less like a harmless sleep disorder and more like the devil's practice session. Stories from that time suggest that people were genuinely scared of sleepwalkers. Picture this: a man in a long nightshirt holding a candle with glazed over eyes, mumbling Latin that he didn't actually know while stepping over farm animals. You'd think he was a ghost or a heretic or both. And depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by bad body fluids, especially too much black bile, which was the medieval excuse for anything they couldn't explain. Others thought it happened because the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body free to wander around like an unattended mule. To prevent these nightly adventures, people tried everything, from herbal medicines to praying over their beds, hanging iron charms, or, in more rural areas, just tying the person's leg to a chair. If that sounds extreme, remember that some medieval homes had open fires, knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically knocked over. In one strange twist, there were rumors of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether or not these stories were exaggerated, the fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and occasional religious debates about whether a person could sin while they were unconscious. Thankfully, most sleepwalkers just paced, muttered, or tried to open imaginary doors. But if someone sleepwalked into a church, locals might see it as a sign from God or call for a cleansing ritual, just to be safe on all spiritual matters. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through noise, church bells, thunderstorms, screaming farm animals, the occasional siege. For the sleep-deprived people of the Middle Ages, these were just background sounds, the medieval version of white noise. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every holy moment of the day: sunrise, prayer times, meals, and of course, the terrible hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were probably set to the soundtrack of regular bell ringing. At some point, your brain just accepted it. Bells became the lullaby for a very busy soul, and it wasn't just bells. Storms were common and scary. With no weather apps or triple-paned windows, you felt every clap of thunder like the world might end. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, and chimneys howled like ghosts. Still, people slept. They had to. Work didn't stop because you couldn't sleep. Neither did plowing fields, praying, or running from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and world-ending events weren't always a reason to stay awake either. In the 14th century, people continued to sleep, somehow through famine, war, and even the Black Death, when death carts rolled by in the morning. It was seen more as a grim wake-up call than a reason to panic. And if you didn't wake up, well, some believed that was a blessing. There are even records of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry mobs. Lack of sleep was common, and bodies got used to it. If you worked from sunrise to sundown, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your day avoiding mud, taxes, and spiritual punishment, you were going to fall asleep hard. And then there were those who used sleep as a kind of escape, faced with sickness, sadness, or the fear of the world literally ending, which was predicted about every century. Some people just curled up under a cloak, mumbled a prayer, and took a nap. There's a strange kind of wisdom in that. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was covered in more than just snow. It was covered in tension, suspicion, and a quiet kind of fear that crept into the wooden homes and frozen fields. The people of Salem were Puritans. They were strict, very religious, and deeply superstitious. They believed they were building a holy town in the wilderness, a city on a hill watched by God and hunted by Satan. Life was already hard. The village had recently split from Salem town because of arguments over politics and religion. Crops had failed. Smallpox had destroyed nearby towns. Wars with Native American tribes had left many people traumatized. There was tension between neighbors, fights over who would inherit land, and a deep dislike for outsiders, or anyone who didn't quite fit in. Add to this the long, dark, and bitter New England winter, and something was about to break. That break happened in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail. Williams began to act strangely. They screamed without control. They threw things. They twisted their bodies in unnatural ways. At times, they would fall silent for hours, their eyes wide with fear. Neighbors whispered that they were cursed. The girls claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Reverend Parris, not sure what to do, called in a local doctor, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical problem, Griggs gave the diagnosis that would throw the village into chaos: witchcraft. That single word lit a fire under the fears already burning in Salem, in a place where witches were believed to be real. Dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not hard to believe. And now, if the devil could sneak his way into the minister's own house, what did that mean for everyone else? The girls, pushed by both adults and their friends, began to name people. First, they accused women who were on the edges of society's social misfits and outcasts. But soon, the accusations would reach the well-respected, the wealthy, and even the very religious. Salem was a small village, but what was about to happen would be heard far beyond its borders. What began as whispers in the dark would soon become cries from the gallows, and a legacy of paranoia that still haunts America's history books. Once the idea of witchcraft took hold in Salem, it spread like a weed. It was quiet at first, then it choked everything it touched. They would shake uncontrollably in court, scream during prayers, and claim they could see dark spirits floating over certain villagers. It wasn't just a childhood game. It was a public performance, and most disturbingly, women who already lived on the edges of society. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, was known for muttering to herself. When people turned her away from their doors, people claimed her muttering was a curse. She smoked a pipe. She yelled at children. She fit the description of a witch because she didn't fit the description of a Puritan woman. Sarah Osborne hadn't gone to church in over a year and had shocked the community by marrying her hired servant after her first husband died. A woman who broke the rules was clearly suspicious. She was from Barbados, and her storytelling, accent, and folklore scared the villagers. Under pressure, and possibly even physical beatings, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. But instead of calming things down, her confession made everything explode. She told the story of a tall man in black, a figure they associated with the devil, who asked her to sign a book. She said she saw strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, and even ghost-like dogs. But the most damaging thing she said was that there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door, others rushed through it. Old fights were hidden behind claims of doing God's work. Fights over land turned into attacks by spirits. If someone's cow died suddenly, it must have been witchcraft. If a baby cried during a prayer, surely that was the devil's work. The fear became so contagious that not even the innocent dared to speak up, to defend an accused, which was to make people suspicious of you. Silence was safety. And so, the web of accusations grew wider, trapping the village in its sticky, invisible threads. Logic was disappearing. Hysteria was now in control. As the accusations grew and the village reached a breaking point, the colonial government stepped in. Governor William Phipps, who had just been appointed and was eager to keep order, created a special court to handle the chaos. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which is French for to hear and determine. But what it really became was a factory for fear-driven justice. The court met in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was not a normal court. Its rules were twisted by panic. Instead of needing hard proof or reliable witnesses, it allowed something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was a testimony that the spirit or specter of the accused person had harmed the victim. In other words, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form choking them in a dream that was allowed as evidence in court, it didn't matter that the accused person could have been asleep at church or miles away. It was their spirit doing the devil's work. You couldn't question a dream, and worse, you couldn't prove it didn't happen. Children were now treated as star witnesses. Their seizures, screams, and gasps in court became more dramatic every day. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she shrieked. If they didn't look at her, she shrieked louder. The performances were captivating, and the judges, including the powerful Judge Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all. Defense lawyers, there were none. The idea didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood alone. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls would twist in pain. Shows people traveled from nearby towns to watch them. The accused were brought into court in chains, often confused, often poor, and almost always powerless. And yet, not everyone believed it. Some townspeople whispered that the girls were faking. Others questioned why only certain types of people were being accused. But few spoke up openly. Questioning the court meant questioning God's will. In Salem, reason had stepped aside, and the law had become a mirror reflecting fear. Her reputation made her an easy target. She wore bright red clothes, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years before. That their babies died after she walked by, and that she kept enchanted dolls. She denied everything. Still, the court found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a bare, windy piece of land just outside Salem. No prayer, no mercy. Death started running. The hangings that followed came quickly. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some had a good reputation in the church. Rebecca Nurse, in particular, was a shocking case. She was an elderly, religious woman who was loved in the community. Even the jury at first found her not guilty. But under pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, the decision was changed. Nurse's final words were whispered through the air like a warning. I am as innocent as the child unborn. But it didn't matter. The noose did not care. In August, more executions followed. On September 22nd, the deadliest day, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had doubted the trials early on, and her husband, Giles Corey, who met a different end. Giles refused to enter a plea. The court, unable to hold a trial without one, used an Old English punishment, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death. Stones were piled on his chest, slowly and cruelly, over 3 days. By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged. One was pressed to death, and at least 5 more died in jail, waiting for their trial. Dozens confessed falsely to save their lives. Over 200 people were accused. The gallows cast long shadows over Salem, not just on the hill, but in every heart. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to its death. While the executions took the spotlight, hundreds of others sat in crowded, foul-smelling jails, waiting for a decision or a miracle. Salem's small jail couldn't hold them all. Accused witches were held in nearby towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starving, freezing, and forgotten. Most of the accused weren't witches, or even outcasts. They were neighbors, friends, parents, and children whose only crime was having an argument with the wrong person or owning land that someone else wanted. In many cases, personal fights, disguised as God's justice, were the reason for the accusations. Clearly, they had cursed the axe. Mary Easty, the sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was one such case. She was a respected mother of 7, known for her religious devotion. She was at first released by the court, but she was rearrested days later after new fits from the afflicted girls. A stop to these proceedings before more innocent blood. She was hanged soon after. Another famous case was that of Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother's arrest, Dorothy was questioned and, under pressure, confessed to being a witch. Her answers, which were just nonsense and fear, were taken as truth. She was put in prison for 8 months, in chains. When she was finally released, she was mentally broken and never recovered from the trauma. Pregnant women were not safe either. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband, John Proctor, would later be hanged, was found guilty and sentenced to die. But because she was pregnant, her execution was delayed. This likely saved her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released after the trials ended. Accusations grew like a snowball. Some accused people confessed in desperation to avoid death, then named others to move the suspicion away from themselves. Entire families were pulled into the mess. Fathers, wives, daughters, no one was safe. Meanwhile, the jails became packed. Food was limited, and disease spread. Some died waiting for their trial, lost in the legal mess of paranoia. And still, new names were added every week. Fall of 1692, the spell of hysteria began to break. Not because the court realized its mistake, but because reality forced its way back in. The turning point came when the accusations grew too bold. People who had once supported the trials suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of them. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested and charged with being the leader of the witches. He was well-educated, well-spoken, and had previously argued with powerful families in the village. That was enough. Something witches were believed to be unable to do. The crowd fell silent. Some cried. Even the tough observers were shaken. But the execution continued. That moment planted a seed of doubt. Then came the accusation against Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the very top of the colony's social ladder. Phipps, already worried by growing criticism and chaos, finally took action. In October 1692, he shut down the court of Oyer and Terminer, stopping all planned executions and trials. Public opinion had shifted. Ministers, who were once silent or went along with it, began to speak out. It were better, he said, that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This was a radical thought in a society that had, for months, believed the exact opposite. People who had once cheered for the trials began to question them. The jails were still full, but the desire for more blood had faded. Too many respected people were being accused. Too many innocent people had been buried. The villagers had begun to see that this wasn't God's justice, it was madness. Confessions dried up. Some accusers took back their stories, others disappeared from public view. And those who had previously shouted the loudest now looked down in shame. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had tired itself out. The public wanted stability. The officials wanted to save their reputations. And Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally ready to wake up from its nightmare. The storm was breaking, but the damage had already been done by late 1692. Court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was formed in early 1693. This time, things were different. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed, and the judges were clearly more doubtful of the accusers' wild claims. The result, the number of convictions dropped dramatically. Many accused witches were found not guilty. Out of 56 cases brought before the new court, most people were released. Even those who had already confessed began to take back their stories, admitting that fear, torture, or pressure had forced them to lie. The dramatic performances of the afflicted girls lost their power to convince people. The most important case in the unraveling of the trials was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who came under suspicion. While he was never officially charged, the fact that such a high-ranking religious man could be suspected showed how random and corrupt the process had become. The court, once fierce, was now careful. They began quietly releasing those still in jail, first those with little evidence against them, and eventually even those who had confessed to witchcraft under force. Meanwhile, the families of the executed began to demand justice. John Proctor's children asked for his property to be returned. Rebecca Nurse's family started a campaign to clear her name. Over time, community shame replaced community fear. Church groups broke apart. Friendships were broken. The very social structure of Salem had been torn to pieces. Governor Phipps, realizing the colony's growing international embarrassment, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But even freedom came with a price. Many families had to pay for their own jail fees before being released. Imagine losing your home, your health, and nearly your life, only to be handed a bill for the privilege of surviving. By the end of the whole ordeal, 19 people had been hanged. 1 was pressed to death, 5 died in jail, and over 200 had been accused. The court didn't just collapse, it imploded, leaving behind a hole of guilt, grief, and disbelief. The trials had ended, but the healing had not even begun. Salem was a village, forever changed by the people it had lost, the justice it had abandoned, and the mirror it was now forced to look into. The gallows were silent, the jails had emptied, but Salem was far from peaceful. The town wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by guilt. What had started with a handful of sick girls had exploded into a community act of destruction. Families had been torn apart, reputations were ruined, and innocent lives had ended. And now, the survivors had to live in the mess. Neighbors could no longer look each other in the eye. The same people who once prayed together had testified against one another. Some of the afflicted girls quietly left town. Others faded from public view. A few, like in Putnam Jr., would later express regret. In 1706, she stood before her church and publicly apologized for her role in the trials, blaming delusion by Satan. But for many, the damage was beyond words. The court officials, too, carried their guilt. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most important figures in the trials, was one of the few to admit he was wrong. In a remarkable act of public apology, he stood during a church service in 1697 while a minister read his confession and prayer for forgiveness. It was a rare moment of taking responsibility in a time when most tried to forget, but forgetting wasn't easy. The families of the executed began demanding payment. Over the years, letters flooded the Massachusetts government, asking for official pardons, for returned property, and for a public statement that the executed were innocent. Slowly, the government responded. In 1711, the colony passed a bill that restored the rights and good names of some of the victims and offered some money to their families. But even that was not complete. Some families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were left out entirely. Whispers of witchcraft never quite left New England, but in Salem, the shame became part of the town's identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, perhaps to distance itself from its infamous past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead, but the memory of what had happened. But the memory lived on, in sermons, in stories, and in the silence between former friends. Salem had not been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by fear, by pride, and by unchecked power. And that curse would remain long after the executions stopped. The Salem witch trials ended more than 3 centuries ago, but their legacy continues to be heard, not just in textbooks and historical tours, but in how we understand justice, fear, and how fragile the truth is. What happened in 1692 wasn't just a strange moment of mass hysteria. It was a breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal fairness in the face of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers became executioners simply by believing too easily and questioning too little. The courts, meant to protect the innocent, became tools of oppression. Religion was used as a weapon. Testimonies became theater, and silence became guilt. One of the most chilling parts of Salem's tragedy is how quickly it happened. In just a matter of months, fear defeated fact. Old fights, disguised as spiritual battles, became death sentences. It didn't take demons or devils. It only took a belief in them. But the trials also taught hard-earned lessons that would affect American society in the years and centuries that followed. The Salem episode would be mentioned again and again in debates about due process and civil rights. The U.S. Constitution, written nearly a century later, would specifically forbid things like ex post facto laws, which had, in effect, doomed the accused in Salem. The guarantee of a right to a lawyer, the right to face your accusers, and the need for real evidence were hard-won principles, created in part from the ashes of Gallows Hill in modern times. The phrase witch hunt has become a shortcut for political persecution or moral panic, though it's often used without thinking about the real terror those words represent. In truth, Salem was not a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems designed to protect them. Perhaps the most lasting lesson is this: fear, when not controlled, can become its own kind of tyranny. And when fear is given legitimacy by power, by courts, by churches, by governments, it becomes almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale, not just of one village's fall into madness, but of how easily reason can fall when fear is given authority. The gallows may be gone, the courtrooms quiet, but the warning still stands. Truth is fragile, justice is not automatic, and history has a habit of repeating itself. Unless we remember, Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the Fulvi family, who were elite but a little eccentric. They were an old commoner family that had long ago climbed its way into the top levels of Roman politics. Although they weren't one of the oldest noble families, the Fulvi had produced consuls, generals, and speakers. Their family line carried both ambition and a habit of causing trouble. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambellio, was known more for his clumsy speech than for his political work. His nickname, Bambellio, literally meant that he stammered But Fulvia, she was no stammerer. She was born to command. From a young age, Fulvia would have been surrounded by the sharp world of Roman power. Senators and generals discussed politics in her home. Elections and betrayal were daily news. She would have seen how politics wasn't just played in the public square, but also in marriages, funerals, rumors, and secret deals. Women in elite Roman homes were expected to be quiet, partners elegant, educated, and obedient. Fulvia would break all of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, and well-connected, and she knew it. While her early life is not well documented, her later actions suggest she was a young woman who was watchful, politically smart, and completely unafraid. This wasn't someone who blended into the background. She had a strong personality, a sharp political mind, and a desire to act, even in the male-dominated world of Roman government. This was also a time of great instability. The Republic was falling apart. Civil wars, popular revolts, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a pressure cooker. The old rules were breaking, and Fulvia grew up right in the middle of it. Instead of shrinking from the chaos, Fulvia would learn to use it. Her early life didn't produce the kind of quiet wife that Rome expected. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a battlefield to be won. She would go on to marry 3 powerful men, each one a radical figure in Roman history. But Fulvia wouldn't just marry power. She would command armies, lead revolts, and become the first Roman woman to appear on a coin, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was not at all traditional. Clodius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a popular troublemaker, a political firestarter with a talent for chaos, scandal, and street-level power. To many of the Roman elite, he was dangerous. To the common people, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity. Their marriage, sometime in the early 50s BCE, joined Fulvia with the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Clodius was famous for his dramatic defiance of tradition. He had once disguised himself as a woman to sneak into a sacred, female-only religious ceremony in Caesar's home. This scandalous behavior only seemed to make him more popular. He later gave up his noble status to run for tribune of the plebs, an office that gave him veto power over the Senate. Clodius understood Rome's street politics better than most, and Fulvia, far from being a quiet wife, was right there with him. She wasn't a silent partner. Roman sources suggest that Fulvia actively took part in her husband's political world. She met with his supporters, was seen during his campaigns, and managed their home as a center for Claudius's politics. Together, they represented a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, popular, and unapologetically aggressive. But this partnership came with a price. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political enemy, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shockwaves through Rome, but Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly. She organized a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Claudius's wounded body through the Roman Forum, with his bloody injuries exposed for maximum impact. The public was horrified and angry. Riots broke out. The Senate house was burned to the ground. Fulvia had turned her personal grief into a public uprising. This was her first major political act, and it worked. Her ability to control public emotion, use spectacle as a strategy, and use her husband's legacy as a weapon made her a new kind of player in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of his shadow, and Rome would never see her the same way again. Fulvia didn't stay in mourning for long. In Rome, political power had a short lifespan, and she understood that better than anyone. Shortly after the violent death of Clodius Pulcher, she entered into a second marriage. This time, it was to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed like a strange match. He had a flashy reputation and a love for drama, but underneath the showmanship was a sharp political mind. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio had enormous influence during one of Rome's most unstable periods. The Republic was on the edge of war and peace. Between Caesar's ambitions and the Senate's resistance, Fulvia saw in Curio not just a husband, but a bridge to the next center of power. This was no romantic rebound. It was a calculated partnership. With Clodius gone, Fulvia needed a new political anchor, someone who could carry on the popular legacy her first husband had built, and someone who had Caesar's support. Curio fit both requirements. Through him, Fulvia remained deeply involved in the shifting power dynamics of Rome. She didn't just marry into the movement, she helped shape it. Fulvia made sure Claudius's supporters stayed active, rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the city's common people politically involved. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey exploded into civil war. Curio threw himself into the fight, taking Caesar's side. Fulvia, as always, remained politically involved. She reportedly helped organize support and manage resources for her husband's campaign. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military mission to Africa to secure Caesar's position, but it was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed by the forces of King Juba of Numidia. His death was brutal, and his army was wiped out. Once again, Fulvia was a widow, and once again, Rome waited to see if she would fade away. She didn't. Curio's death only strengthened her status as a political widow with dangerous resilience. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil unrest, and both had died fighting for popular causes. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most daring partnership and her most dramatic chapter was still to come. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, formed around 47 BCE, was not just a romantic connection, it was a merger of power. Fulvia had already proven herself as a master of Roman street politics. Antony, rising quickly through the military and political ranks, needed that kind of smart support in Rome. Together, they formed one of the most politically powerful couples of the late Republic. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and outsmarted countless enemies. Antony was no stranger to scandal either. He drank, he gambled, and his personal life was famously chaotic. But with Fulvia, he had found someone who could do more than just entertain him. She could defend his interests, hold his alliances together, and gather supporters when he was away on military campaigns. And Antony, despite his loud personality, understood her value. He allowed Fulvia to have authority that no Roman woman had ever publicly held before. She opened his mail, she gave orders when he was away, she sat in on meetings, and she influenced appointments. Roman sources, which were mostly hostile, described her as bossy and power-hungry. But what bothered them most wasn't her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no words for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was thrown into chaos once more. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir. But it was Fulvia who held Rome itself. while Antony formed the second triumvirate. Octavian and Lepidus. Fulvia acted as his representative in the capital. She managed networks of supporters, dealt with street gangs, and made sure Antony's supporters stayed loyal. She even helped arrange Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter, Claudia, to him, a partnership that would later publicly implode. Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife, but as his stand-in. Roman coins were made with both Antony's image and her name on them, an unheard-of acknowledgement of her status. She wasn't hidden in the shadows of power. She stood in its full light. But power in Rome was always borrowed, and Fulvia was about to test the limits of how far a woman could go before Rome snapped back. While Mark Antony was pursuing military campaigns and political deals across the Roman world, it was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome. She wasn't just his wife. She was his regent in everything but name. In a period where violence, bribery, and raw influence kept order, Fulvia proved she could play the game as well as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. Rome, after Caesar's assassination, was a battlefield without swords. Power had become a moving target. Fulvia understood this, and she secured Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his political substitute. She directed allies, dealt with the city's common people, negotiated with different factions, and, most daringly, waged war with words and silver. She financed loyal troops, offered bribes to keep public order, and ensured that any new laws passed would favor Antony's future. Some ancient sources, especially hostile ones like Appian and Dio Cassius, paint Fulvia as manipulative, bossy, and even a warmonger. But beneath the misogynistic exaggeration lies a woman actively involved in politics. In a world that had no rules for a woman doing anything besides weaving and mourning, Fulvia was building alliances, backing military commanders, and even issuing orders, tasks normally reserved for senators and consuls. She also made public appearances and maintained strong relationships with veteran soldiers, a politically vital group in the power struggles of the late Republic. While Antony was campaigning in the East, Fulvia was often the face of his authority. In Italy, meeting with centurions, influencing decisions about land distribution, and reminding the soldiers that their loyalty to Antony came with rewards. But this accumulation of power came at a cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly the group aligned with Octavian Caesar's heir and Antony's increasingly bitter rivalry, scented Fulvia's influence. They saw her as a meddling woman with too much power over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act without a male guardian was not just threatening, it was unprecedented. Fulvia wasn't naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was growing. She could see that their alliance was cracking, and she understood something that neither man seemed to fully grasp yet. The Republic wasn't big enough for both of them. So, Fulvia began preparing for the next phase, not diplomacy, but confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now, she was ready to take it into her own hands. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus, and she didn't do it quietly. With her husband, Mark Antony, still stationed in the East, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a consul, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's authority in Italy. The official reason was to defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of Roman veterans loyal to him. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman. It was the first and only time in Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and organize a civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusian War, was started by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which forced many Italians out of their homes to reward his soldiers. Fulvia used the growing anger, painting Octavian as a tyrant and a traitor to Caesar's legacy. With Lucius acting as her frontman in the Senate and Fulvia organizing behind the scenes, they raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perugia, modern-day Moragia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources suggest she was more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She gathered troops, stirred up the public, and even corresponded with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions, giving orders, and forcing Lucius into fights he didn't want. Octavian, though surprised, acted quickly. He laid siege to Perugia through the winter of 41 to 40 BCE, cutting off supplies and hammering the city into submission. Fulvia, stuck between running out of food and political betrayal, watched her bold gamble fall apart. But Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now considered too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony. But Antony didn't come running. The once alliance between husband and wife had crumbled in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his blessing. And now the Republic had made her pay the price. Banished from Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had become a kind of diplomatic waiting room for failed power players. She had gone to war not for personal gain, but in her husband's name. Fulvia had risked everything, her status, her alliances, her life, and yet Antony did not immediately rush to meet her. In fact, by the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, was crushing. While Fulvia was raising legions, Antony was raising goblets at parties, next to a queen. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally, but politically. The consequences alone. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, suggest that Antony was furious with her for starting the Pyrrhocine War without his direct approval. Others argue he was happy about her downfall. It cleared the way for a marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would have never allowed. Still, Fulvia wasn't entirely without supporters. Health had begun to fail. After enduring a siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE. She was around 43 years old, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their plans, was gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myth outshone nearly every Roman woman of the period. She marched into it, stood at the center, and dared to command armies in a world that treated women like furniture. But the ashes of her rebellion would linger, and her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death in 40 BCE, the men she had once outmaneuvered, Danae, Octavian, and even her former allies, began the quiet work of rewriting her legacy. And like so many powerful women in history, Fulvia became a scapegoat. Ancient sources, mostly written by men with their own agendas, the conflict between Antony and Octavian, and even the general chaos of the Republic. Appian, Dio, Cassius, and Plutarch describe her as overbearing, jealous, and driven by a lust for power. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into conflict, for provoking Octavian, and even for Antony's eventual separation from Rome. But were these accusations fair? Hardly. Fulvia had operated in a political environment where violence and manipulation were expected, at least if you were a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would eventually prove to be. She wasn't hidden away in the home, weaving quietly or serving as a political decoration to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she had fought to preserve, conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife after making peace with Octavian and marrying his sister. Antony used Fulvia's death as a diplomatic fresh start. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no grand funeral, no mourning speeches in the Senate, just silence. Yet her enemies couldn't erase her completely. Fulvia had done too much. She had raised armies, influenced elections, negotiated alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on a coin, not as a deity or a metaphor, but as a political player. The damage to her reputation was intentional, but so was her presence in the historical record. Despite every attempt to bury her behind caricature and slander, Fulvia refused to vanish. In the centuries that followed her death, historians and writers struggled to place her in Rome's grand story. Because Fulvia broke every rule of what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She didn't just advise power from the shadows, she became power. And that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whispers and marriage, Fulvia shouted through policy, war, and political theater. She was not a companion, she was a commander. Her achievements. Roman historians couldn't handle a woman who didn't stay in her place. So they rewrote her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive. But if you read between the lines, a different person emerges. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her name. She organized political groups, used marriage as a tactical weapon, and manipulated Roman street politics with stunning skill. She moved through the civil wars of the 1st century BCE, not as a bystander. It was because of timing and gender. Later, Roman women, like Livia Drusilla the Younger, and even Cleopatra herself, though from a different world, would all operate in the shadow that Fulvia helped create. They would manipulate emperors, command armies, and control successions. But Fulvia did it first, and with no imperial title to protect her. Today, modern historians have begun to re-examine Fulvia with fresh eyes. No longer a cautionary tale. She is being recognized as one of the most politically active women in Roman history. Someone who tested the boundaries of female power and paid the price. She didn't simply live in the age of triumvirs. She challenged them. And while Rome may have tried to erase her, Fulvia left fingerprints in every corner of its collapse. Not a footnote, but a force. A woman centuries ahead of her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country torn between two worlds. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social custom, it was the law. Black Americans were banned from restaurants, schools, buses, voting, booths, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality was common, lynchings still happened. And in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were being met with snarling dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had exploded into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become common headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names. They were symbols of defiance. The March on Washington wasn't born from a single conversation. It was the result of growing frustration and fierce hope. Black Americans were no longer willing to wait. D.C. had been around for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had first proposed the idea in the 1940s. That protest was called off after Roosevelt gave in and signed an executive order. Randolph, along with other civil rights leaders, including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., brought the vision back to life. And this time, they weren't just marching for jobs, they were marching for dignity, for voting rights, for school desegregation, for equal pay, and most importantly, for the basic human right to live free of fear. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan it, despite their many disagreements, because they understood the power of a united front. The countdown had begun. Buses were being organized, flyers were spreading, and word of was moving faster than newspapers. Across the country, Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable moments in American history. The dream was taking shape, one footstep at a time. Pulling off a protest of any kind in Washington, D.C. was a big deal. But planning one for over 100,000 people, possibly more, was madness. From a logistics point of view, it sounded like a nightmare. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, and safety plans. And yet, somehow, they made it happen. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often kept in the background for political reasons, was a master strategist. Rustin had once studied non-violence directly under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India. He had marched, been jailed, been beaten, and was watched by the FBI, but nothing bothered him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, non-violent protest could achieve when organized with military-like precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team turned the idea into a reality. The march was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was deliberately framed to include both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message was no accident. While Dr. King would later become the spiritual symbol of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the demands were just as much about unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights as they were about civil rights. Meanwhile, tensions were simmering under the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were nervous, deeply nervous. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the National Guard was on standby. In D.C. were put on alert, and liquor sales were banned for the day. Federal workers were even told they could stay home. And then there was the question of unity. The Big Six civil rights organizations, AACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, FOFN, clashed over strategies. Some wanted more radical action, while others preferred more diplomacy. SNCC's young firebrands were growing impatient with King's nonviolent approach, but they all agreed on this. The time for silence had passed. Rustin's plan read like a military operation. Every bus and train was tracked. Every speaker was timed to the minute, and every route had marshals trained in crowd control. They weren't just planning a march. They were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation. August 28, 1963. A boiling hot Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already hot by 9 a.m., and the humidity stuck to the skin like a second shirt. But it didn't stop them. From every corner of the country, they came. Black, white, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their best Sunday clothes. Others clutched protest signs. They came by bus, train, carpool, and even on foot. Over 250,000 people in total, gathering on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And yet there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of riots and unrest, the scene was surprisingly calm. Volunteers directed foot traffic. The Red Cross handed out water, and groups sang freedom songs, held hands, and cheered as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and chants of jobs and freedom echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined in, to Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one person. The crowd was orderly but energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this wasn't just a protest. It was a sacred moment. For many Black Americans, just standing on the mall felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be seen, to be counted, to say we are here in front of the same Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in Stoneit was a full circle moment, generations in the making. At exactly noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, ideas, and regions, but united in their message. Speakers demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a living wage, and an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang. Marian Anderson, who had once been banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands under the open sky. As the hours passed, the tension grew, not from unrest, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken, and when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march wasn't just making history, it was becoming a legend. Minute, by mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown quiet, not because they were tired, but because they knew what was coming. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely hid the fire building inside him. He carried prepared remarks, typed and written with his advisors the night before. But what the world would remember wasn't what had been typed. It was what came from his heart. He began with controlled passion, outlining the harsh realities of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence, not as fillers, but as tools. The crowd listened, completely, focused. Some nodded, some wiped away tears, others held signs that simply read, "Now." But it was what happened next that changed the tone of the entire event, and arguably the path of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. She suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and launched into a passage he'd delivered before, but never like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase rang louder, clearer, more determined. "I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood." It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history. By the time King closed with the words, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted. There was applause, tears, and shouts of joy. They knew they had just witnessed something more. Then a great speech. They had heard a prophecy. The power of the March on Washington wasn't just in the speeches or the music. It was in the people. The sheer number of people gathered that day was overwhelming. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and everywhere in between. Some were experienced activists who had marched a dozen times before. Others had never left their hometowns until now. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes, just to be there. Many were ordinary people, maids, teachers, steelworkers, postal clerks, who saw themselves not as political figures, but as witnesses. They didn't just want change. They were the change. There were also children in the crowd. Young black girls with ribbons in their hair. Boys with hand-drawn signs. Parents lifted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speakers' voices carried over loudspeakers. To them, this wasn't just an event. It was the beginning of a new world. Some faces stood. Out there was a young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech had been so fiery, so unwilling to compromise, that senior leaders asked him to tone it down minutes before he went on stage. He agreed, but just barely. His call for radical change still shook the crowd. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day. She didn't speak for herself, but read a prepared statement on behalf of other civil rights women. The organizers had faced criticism for pushing female voices to the side. Bates's brief but powerful message highlighted a harsh reality, even within a movement about equality. Some voices still struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students of every background. They didn't all agree on strategy, but for that one day, those differences didn't matter. Unity won. It was a visual symphony of American possibility. White and black hands linked in solidarity. Freedom now. Buttons pinned to chests, and the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd weren't just watching history unfold. They were shaping it, and none of them would ever forget what they saw. While the world saw unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple. What looked like a perfectly synchronized movement was, in truth, held together, with string, sweat, and a lot of last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the chief architect of the march, had to battle not just logistics, but also politics. He was constantly under scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be used to discredit the movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King didn't remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That threat haunted every stage of planning. Then there was the issue of women's voices. Despite the critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver major speeches on their own. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, respected by all, but she was not given the microphone. Behind the powerful images of the march lay the truth. The movement still struggled with its own internal power structures and blind spots. Even within the Big Six organizations, tension bubbled. SNCC leaders were growing increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of change and the older generation's focus on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more aggressively. CORE had similar frustrations, but for one day, unity was considered too important. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to spy on the organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, followed key figures, and created files on them. They were convinced the march would turn violent or that communists would hijack the event. When nothing like that happened, they simply increased their surveillance, especially of Dr. King. And let's not forget the money. The march cost over $250,000, which is equivalent to millions today. Most of it was raised through unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled until the final hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished, just like the country it sought to heal. The sun began to set behind the Washington Monument as the crowds slowly left. People hugged, cried, sang, and stayed as long as they could, not wanting to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered. The signs had been raised high. The world had watched. And now the question hung heavy in the humid August air. What happens next? In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of distant curiosity. Some called it orderly and dignified, which was code for no one rioted. Few news outlets gave much space to the specific demands of the march, like the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage, equivalent to around $20 today. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That, at least, could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and perhaps surprise. He called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward, but legislative progress remained slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stuck in Congress, caught in the grip of Southern opposition. Some activists were disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate action. Instead, it was back to the hard work of organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who paid the price for justice. Just weeks later, that reality hit hard. On September 15, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream had been spoken, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. Still, something had changed. The March on Washington marked a new phase. In the civil rights movement, it proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a coalition broader than ever before: labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working Americans, all in one place, united by justice. And most of all, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world. The march was over, but the road was just beginning. And that road would soon lead through blood, legislation, and transformation. The March on Washington didn't just shake the conscience of America. It reshaped its moral landscape. What had begun as a bold act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently changing how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. In terms of laws, the march didn't bring immediate victories, but it created momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the very heart of Jim Crow laws. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech that day launched him into a new level of fame. He went from being a respected leader to a global icon. But fame came with a cost: surveillance, threats, and ultimately, his assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke of on those steps would become more meaningful, more tragic, and more honored with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity could achieve. It gave organizers a blueprint for large-scale mobilization, and it inspired a generation of activists, both in the US and abroad. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe would point to the March on Washington as a model. But the legacy isn't just historical. The language of the marched idea of jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of I Have a Dream still pulses through modern protests. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, echoes of 1963 are heard with every chant and every cardboard sign. In Washington, D.C., King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering statue carved in stone with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial isn't in stone. It's in classrooms, voting booths, marches, and voices refusing to stay silent. Because the dream wasn't meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon, when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder under the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been preserved in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools. His voice, steady and strong, echoes in the national memory like a sacred song. But for many, the question remains, has the dream been realized, or has it merely been delayed? In some ways, the progress is undeniable. The legal system of segregation was taken apart. Voting rights, though now facing new attacks in many states, were won through blood, marches, and court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal in much of the country, is now protected by federal law. These are not small things. They are victories carved out by relentless struggle, and yet the original demands of the marched ones, often overshadowed by King's speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage is still unmet. Racial gaps in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to cause outrage and protest. The dream of true economic justice, of a country where opportunity is not determined by your zip code or skin color, is still far from reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the fight, often using the imagery and words of the 1963 march as both inspiration and a challenge. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same basic human rights. But they do so in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the end. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, this is who we are, and this is what we demand. It was a declaration, not a final resolution. So, the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is delayed, distorted, or one day fulfilled, depends not on the past, but on us, on the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we find to march again and again until the dream becomes a shared, lived reality.